the topic, as Kathy said, is on revegetation, and the biodiversity, productivity, and sustainability are what come from the revegetation if you do it correctly. So that's what we're going to be talking through. I'm going to start with the end answer by saying here is the bottom line, and then we'll go through how you actually arrive at that bottom line by talking about various aspects of revegetation design. So okay, there it is. To just take the bottom line, this is just a snapshot of some of the things that I'll be showing you as we go through, but you increase productivity, 20% in additional vegetation on your farm. Let's say you start with just paddocks and nothing else. You'll increase productivity by sometimes somewhere around 20 to 40%. Live weight gains in sheep and cattle go up substantially. The property capital value of your property goes up substantially. It captures 10 times, that revegetation area captures 10 times the carbon capture of grasslands. Increases net revenues in a whole range of areas, but the one that I've highlighted here is between 27 and 52% in drought years. So again, it's not so much of a problem for people in the equine group, but if you're actually, unless you're registering horses, of course, if you're a farmer, that 52% increase in drought years is one heck of a difference, because that's when you're really and truly hurting. Decreases the rate of grassland fire spread. A lot of people raise their eyes at that, so bear with me. And provides a local buffer against climate change. So that's what we're going to look at as we go through. But let's start. I should also say there are no downsides at all to this particular aspect. The first thing is, you don't just simply suddenly say, well, I'm going to put in a shelter belt, for example, or a bush patch or whatever. You look at your entire property, what the structure of the property is, where the fences are. That'd be the fences here, for example, around the edge here. If there's a road through this, in this little example, there's a road coming through here. And do you have a creek and everything else? So once you've got that, you then look at the climatology for the region and where the winds are coming from, and that tells you where you need to do things. Now, since you've already got fences, the normal way of doing it is to actually put it along fences, because you've already carved up the paddocks in that sense. You don't have to. You could have an area of a particularly bad soil, for example. The Australian natives couldn't care less about the quality of the soil very much, so you could put it along that line of bad soil. If you have a stream, vegetating it is extremely good. It won't so much help the local wind regimes or anything like that, but it'll provide you with cleaner water. It'll provide you with more water. And also, if everyone upstream and downstream does it, all your neighbours and everyone get cleaner water as well. And that's where Melbourne Water, for example, come in the overall process. Do consider your neighbours and what they've got in place, because that can actually help you modify or change what you're going to do yourselves. And finally, the good old bush tree in the paddock, the great big old tree that's been there probably from when the farm was actually developed. They are important, and it's actually worth your while putting more in. They're important because they provide a lot of shade for your stock. They're important because they provide a method of actually water getting into your ground better than the grass will provide. And finally, they're important because they're actually wonderful little ecosystems in their own right. So we'll move on to the next slide.
Handful now.
Now, so you want to have a shelter belt. How do you build it? Well, this little diagram here pretty well shows it quite nicely. Firstly, you have a ridge of high scrub, and we usually use eucalypts, but it doesn't have to be, along the centre line. Then you have smaller shrubs and trees, but still quite large. And then you come down to smaller again, and you might even throw in a few sedges and grasses and such. The important thing is that you have a nice smooth area going over the top. That's the first thing. The second important thing is that you have gaps, little gaps in here, so that basically the air here can flow through. We'll start there. Why is that important? Well, that's important because if the air is flowing over the top here, and there's no way for that air to flow through down in here, then you'll actually generate a partial vacuum here. That vacuum will drag this air straight back to the ground and may even cause it to eddy, and you've actually lost all the benefit of your shelter belt almost instantly. If you do it like this and you put it all together correctly, then basically this air that's coming over the top can go anything up to about 20 times the height of the trees. We typically recommend 10 as the area you expect. So if you've got a 20-meter tree, we're talking 100 or 200 meters before that air actually gets back to the ground, which is a large paddock or a large slice of your farm. There's various other details on the side there, but I won't go into the details. I just want you to get the general image here. The final thing is, you don't just put a single row of trees. They are actually can be worse than putting no trees at all. You need to have a certain depth to that shelter belt. 15 meters, 10 meters you might get away with. 15 meters is sort of towards the middle. 25 meters is perfect. Now, not everyone has a 25-meter patch around the edge of their farm that they can do, but you can afford 15. And if you don't do 15, then you're actually, you may as well not do the shelter belt in a lot of cases. We insist on a minimum of 15 for the ones that we're putting in. Here's what it looks like in the real world. Let's look off in the distance, and you can see the high row of trees. And you can see how it comes down like this. You can see a bit better how it comes down through here. So it comes back in a nice smooth thing, smooth area. You can see the holes through here so that the air can filter through and do everything else. When you're doing this, everything you can see in this paddock and then more is improved substantially. And we'll show you that in a few slides from now. But you notice it's not perfect. Real world is never perfect. There's a tree sticking up here a bit higher than the others. It doesn't matter. It's a minor aberration in the overall scheme of things, provided it's about right. And this is a bit lower. That's fine. The real world is fine in that context. However, some things you don't want to do. Let's say you put a shelter belt in on your farm, and it finishes at a fence, and the wind direction is from this side, then the wind's going to come up over here and eddy down into here and blow straight back down to the surface, and you've done yourself a disservice. When the wind blows from the other direction, such as happening here, you're actually doing yourself a favor now. Well, you're doing, in this case, your neighbor a favor, because you're providing a shelter belt that they can use. So basically, make sure that it doesn't have sharp finishes to it. But beyond that, pretty well any shape is okay, so long as it's at roughly that sort of nice circumference, arced over shape in the overall system. They're all fine. You don't have to be too pedantic there. It is actually a good idea, by the way, given this, if you have a fence line, if you can get your neighbor to do the bit on this side and you do the bit on this side, then suddenly you both won and you both use less of your properties. Do try to avoid a range of things. Firstly, don't have narrow, dense, or open shelter belts. We'll come back to this a little bit more in a bit. Secondly, there are wind accelerators. Say that the wind over here is blowing from this direction. And what will happen here, if you've got a sharp edge like this end on this, like here, the wind will come down, it'll be turning along here, and it'll come around here, and it'll eddy right back across here, and you'll have a jet of air flowing all the way across here. The air is blowing from this direction, now, and you have a gap. Well, if you have a gap, the same thing happens. You actually get a narrow jet of air which comes through there and belts off across the paddock. And if you have any doubts about any of these, it's fairly easy to find these sorts of situations in your neighborhood. Just go stand there and feel the wind one day. You'll be surprised just how strong it is. You can do all of that. You can get rid of this by going around corners. Don't finish it like that, come around the corner. Or you could put a bush patch here. or you can cover the hole here by just simply putting a bit of scrub in front of the hole, or you could just have a line that actually came at an angle through there. So there's a number of ways you can actually fix that. Just try not to do any of those if you can help it. In the benefits, let's start with the species. It's a little bit of a complex figure, so I'm going to go through it a bit with you. What you have here is the number of species. So that's the biodiversity, or it's one measure of the biodiversity. What we have here is there's a forest over here, and there's grassland over here, and this is the edge between the two, this zone in here. And the little markers here are the number of species that were observed, where the black line is the average number, and the lines here give you an idea of the spread in the numbers. In other words, they're not all the same. You might go back one time and they're one number, and then next time it's a little bit different number. So this gives you the spread in the number. And the dark ones are the same thing. Oh, sorry, that's when you first start putting in your shelter belt or your bush patch or whatever it is. These ones here, after the whole thing has become stable, which in the case of a lot of bush, it could be 100 years, but it takes a while. So let's just look at what's happened. Firstly, over here in the paddock, there's essentially no change. In other words, the number of grassland species is the same after you've built this forest off in the distance as before. If you come over into the forest, for a bit, there is actually an increased number of species. In other words, if it was grassy to start with like that, and then you put in your trees, the number of species goes up. Why? Because you've got a lot of young trees and bushes that are actually getting going. So a few forest species have started to move in, but most of the grassland species are also still there. They're still hanging around. It hasn't got to be a bad region for them yet, so they're still around. So that's why you get this increase here. As time goes on and everything settles down, you drop down to a stable situation where you have the stable number of forest species, and these will be different species than the ones over here. But an interesting thing happens around the edge. Around the edge, you'll notice that to start with, we're a bit like all across here, but then as time goes on, the number of species goes up. It also goes up just in here. Why is that happening? That's happening because there are a large number of species. This is birds, insects, furry things, bats, you name it. There's a large number of species that are either edge specialists, they live only on the edge of things, or they're bushland species that have come out close to the edge so that they can go out and grab a little bit of extra feed and such out in the grasses, and then come back and hide back into the bush. So that's the reason for that there. And this now tells you a story. If you have lots of good edges with bush behind and grass in front of it, you actually end up with the highest biodiversity that you can get. This is a rule that applies pretty well universally. And if we look at a bit more of an example, let's look at where we live. There's two types of edges here. Firstly, we've got a coast. That coastline has a heck of a lot more, let's just use birds. There's a heck of a lot more birds than what you see when you go in or when you get back out over the water, because it's a fertile area for them. They can come ashore, they may even nest ashore, and then they can go out here and they come back ashore and so on. We've also got lots of bush patches. These dark green areas are bush patches. The edges of these are just like that diagram I showed you before. So this is Green's bush and the edges of that. Then you come down to smaller bush patches. Then you come down to shelter belts. They're all very good because of that edge effect. So you're producing an increase in biodiversity that is higher than would have been if you had only grass, and which would have been if you had only bush. Why is biodiversity important? I put a little pointer there that you can get. I'll send the talk to Kathy so she can send this around so you can pick up the pointer there. But biodiversity is important because the more biodiverse it is, the more beneficial animals you have there that are actually coming out and eating the bad bugs. You have bats, you have birds, you have spiders, you have lizards, you have a whole range of things that are coming out and eating away and chomping on the things that are actually damaging your pasture. I also have to say that you have to be patient here. This is a schematic of the of what that shelter belt or that bush patch will look like in time. So you start off with a lot of little scrubs and bushes and that, and then it builds up and you start to get other things coming in. You get mistletoe, you start to get creepers, you start to get things growing up the trees, and on it goes 10 to 19, 20 to 50, up to 50 to 100 years. So let's say you were, let's say 25 years old and you planted a shelter belt, then the shelter belt would be just starting to get going properly by the time your kids were in high school. And then the shelter belt would continue to mature and it would start to pick up hollows and things like that and provide increased habitat and such by the time your kids are having kids, your grandkids. And it will actually only become mature from a biodiversity viewpoint by the time your grandkids are having kids. So when you're actually doing these things, it's not just something you put in today and then forget about forever. Think about it, spend a bit of time looking after it, and you will get paid dividends. And not only that, but future generations a long way down the line will get dividends as well. Let's move off biodiversity and just look at the direct benefits to your property. Again, a little bit of a messy diagram here, so let's look at it. We've got a shelter belt here. The numbers here are the value relative to open, unsheltered paddocks. So 1 means nothing's happened. 0.2 means it's 20% higher. 0.8 means it's 20% lower. The distance out here is in height, shelter belt heights. In other words, the height of the highest tree line of trees. And basically for the sort of trees, sort of shelter belts we put in, this here would be around, this would be about 150, 160 meters, to give you an example of the distance we're talking about. Let's start down the bottom. We have the wind that is coming in here across a paddock and hits the shelter belt. It actually drops across this whole 150 meters by more than 50%. The evaporation drops by around about 30%, maybe a bit more, yeah, probably more than 30%, but in that sort of an order. The relative humidity across your paddock goes up, so your grass and everything else is going to grow better. It likes relative humidity. If you're talking at winter and cold temperatures and strong winds and that, the soil temperature goes up. So your grass keeps growing for longer and it starts growing earlier in the season. And finally, if you're just looking at a generic sort of crop, by this I mean a pasture type crop, it goes up as well. And it goes up by around 20%, that number I showed you before. So all of these things are happening because you put in the shelter belt. And you can now start to appreciate why, when there is a shelter belt or a bush patch go in, how much it really benefits your property. And even though you've lost a little bit of paddock, you've gained more than you lost. Move on to the next one. This is a little bit of a quantification now of what I was just talking about. The left-hand figure is from a paper, quite an old paper now, but it's still one of the Bible type papers. This was a lady who actually went out and checked properties that were putting in vegetation over a period of 20 odd years. So she actually mapped what was happening to those properties over that time. In southern New South Wales, this is, so it's relatively relevant to here. And you can see this is all in $95. So you can put you probably put another zero on this nowadays. But you can see as you add vegetation, 10%, 20%, 30%, your productivity or your value of the crop goes up substantially and quickly. Then it starts to tail off. Getting my map, starts to tail off. It reached its peak at about 35%. So you could have 35% of your property under vegetation, and that would be the maximum productivity you would get. In this example, it's somewhere around 20 to 30% or 20 to even higher than 30% is where you get it. The interesting thing is you've got to get up to about 60 or 70% before you get back to the productivity of the bare paddock. Let's look over on the right-hand side. This is now biodiversity, where this is species richness, which is a little bit different to just numbers of species. It's the numbers of species modified by how many of each individual member is in that species. So it gives you an idea of, if you just had one parrot, one bat, and one cockatoo, that wouldn't be much. But if you had 1,000 bats and 1,000 parrots, so that gives you a higher number. And you can see here the wooded vegetation across here in hectares. This was relative to 800 hectare blocks. So this bit here is 10% of the area covered by bush, or by bush patches or shelter belts. You see how the biodiversity goes up? It climbs up and up and up, climbs very quickly down here, then climbs up and up and up. And by the time we get up to here, it's getting towards twice what it was for a paddock. And then you go on and it keeps on going up, but it doesn't go up forever. If you go up far enough, it all starts to flatten out and you end up with that diagram that I showed you before, where the stable situation sort of thing. But there is a substantial increase in both biodiversity and productivity when you do these things. This is an expansion on what I showed you earlier on in the bottom line. Here's just some examples of actual measurements. These are not modeled or anything like that. These are actual measurements. Increase yields by 17 to 18% in dry years, 13 to 15% in normal years, and 6 to 9% in favorable years. The net effect of that in terms of dollars is 27 to 52% in drought years, which is what the number I showed you before, and the reference is down at the bottom there. By the way, where I've got these references in blue, all you have to do is click on it and you can actually get the entire reference. And I warn you, a lot of them are quite readable, but some of them are fairly jargonistic. So, have a look and see if you're happy with reading it. But I just leave it there so that you can make sure that what I'm talking about is real. Let's look at bushfire. The knee-jerk reaction that you get is, oh, you're going to put in the bush, that's going to increase the bushfire possibilities. Well, no, actually. Here is an actual bushfire, or after the event, after it had burnt. These were a set of grass fires, all coming in a wind that was obviously blowing this way. And let's just look at this shelter belt here. There was no flames got into here. They went around it and they went around on this side and then started to build back across again. Even fairly narrow lines like this one, it was the grass was stopping at it. There's a shelter belt in there. The grass stopped at it, but there was a couple of spots where the fire managed to get through. Probably there were holes in the shelter belt. So basically, just looking at that, you can get a visual idea of how, for grass fires at least, shelter belts are good value. You can put some numbers on that. This is from a couple of references, but mainly from the CFA. They slow the wind, shelter belts. Therefore, the fire's going to go slower and you've got more time to catch it and stop it. The lee is moister and cooler. I've already showed you those numbers. So the fire's going to not burn as well. And you just saw the example of how it slows a grass fire. The negatives If the wind is along the shelter belt, it may get an acceleration of the wind of the fire along that shelter belt. So the one real rule here is don't build a shelter belt coming up a hill and ending in your house, because then going up a hill, it's going to accelerate, and it might also accelerate because of the shelter belt. So we never do that. We typically build the shelter belts across the wind or across the hill or across the top of the hill or around the hill. So basically, you don't actually end up with that problem. And then there's various other immediate remediation things you can do, and this is just a couple of examples there. One important thing here is use native species. And I'll come back to that again. If you use exotic species, it's a very different game. So let's move on to exotic species. Just checking the clock here. Pine trees and cypress trees are about the worst thing you can do to plant on your property. They have almost no good impact at all. If you do a set of pine trees like I've shown here, or cypress, the wind that was going to go smoothly over the top, this wind can't get through. It's blocked. So the low pressure here, and you get that eddying and the wind coming back rapidly to the surface that I told you about. They provide no climate resilience. They dry out in here instead of bringing more moisture into the soil. They dry the soil out, and their roots come out at some distance either side. And if they get burnt, they're gone. So you could be growing these for 50 or 100 years. Bushfire comes through, they're gone. You got to start again and spend another 50 or 100 years. Eucalypts and such would actually say, oh, that was not very good, and start shooting again immediately. So basically, there are no good things about exotics. And here is the worst example I've seen in a while. This is on the peninsula, not far from where I live. That's a cypress hedge, which is quite high. You can see how high it is by the height of the fence here. It's very sharp. It's completely obstructing the wind. And I can say with confidence that the person who put that up is actually decreasing the productivity of both their paddock and the paddock of the people that I'm standing on substantially more than it would have been if it was just simply bare paddock. That's actually made the whole thing worse. So please stay away from cypress and everything else. Right, so we're on the home stretch. Just a quick summary, just to get your brain back to what we've done. Summary, do adopt a whole farm view. Don't skimp on the design or the width, and take your time, because as I said, it's going to be 100 years before it reaches its full potential. Use indigenous plants. And almost without exception, the productivity's benefits outweigh the loss of pasture in doing this. Which brings us to climate change. And I guess here, wait a minute, I'm sorry about that. There's supposed to be 2 slides here, and that one's jumped over the top. Forget about the writing at the bottom. One question I get asked is, should I use indigenous vegetation or plan for getting vegetation from a warmer environment? We've looked into this in some detail, and I have to say the answer is uncertain, but it is highly likely that you're better off just using local indigenous, especially for trees. Think about a messmate or a peppermint gum. I can take you up several hundred kilometers to the north, and you'll see the same peppermint gum and the same messmate. So basically, there's no real benefit in bringing them down to here in that context. When it comes to smaller trees and bushes, they're fairly short lifetime, and they will rapidly adjust to what's happening with climate change. And if you're talking about grasses, then they adjust even more rapidly. So it's not too much of an issue with grasses or anything else. You can buy them from anywhere. But if you're going to be putting in tall trees and things like that, I recommend you stick with what you've got locally. I will say that selecting for soil type is important. You have to select plants that are suitable to your soil type. And that's where the ecological vegetation community classification comes in. If you don't know what that means, ask someone in land care to explain it to you. That now went away, which it wouldn't do before. So taking action, if you do all of this and you take action at the landscape scale, and now I'm talking more than just your neighbour, over a large area, you maximise the biodiversity even further and all the associated benefits. You get cleaner water, as I said before, because all this bush and that actually inhibits flooding, and because it actually takes a lot more water out of the rainfall and puts it into the ground, it reduces flooding potential, and it reduces the local impacts of climate change. We'll come to that in the next slide. Climate change reduction. Firstly, it does remove carbon dioxide. As those trees are growing, they're taking carbon dioxide out of the air, putting oxygen back into the air, and putting the carbon into their growth stuff. If you go to the references in this, you can find references that are quite viable and quite accurate that give you anything from 2 to 26 tonnes per hectare per year is what you're taking out of carbon dioxide. The government tends to use 2, which is ridiculously low. We use 10 tonne per hectare per year as being a good example here while your biodiversity stuff, or while your bush is growing. Once it gets to about 50 or 60 years old, that number tails off quite substantially, and it doesn't go down, but it's not increasing at anywhere near the same rate. A lot of people think of this as a potential source of additional income. Be careful. If you sell your carbon credits and you're then going to sell your property will be sold for less. And if you're actually producing agricultural products, it is not going to be too much longer before you're going to be having to make your property carbon neutral before you can even sell them, and you've given away your biggest asset. It slows water and everything else. I've already talked about that one. It provides shelter and shade and all that sort of thing. And the punchline is down the bottom here. If you do it on a landscape scale, and now I'm talking, say, the peninsula scale, and you do it properly, you end up with a local cooling of about 1 to 2 degrees C. Thus far, Australia is heated up by 1.5 degrees C. So as we go on to be doing this, we're going to essentially be negating the temperature part of the climate change on the peninsula by doing all of this. It won't change the extreme weather and everything else because that's being generated elsewhere, but it will change the local conditions substantially. And getting towards finishing, I'm not going to this in detail. As Kathy knows, you'll hear more and more about this. We are trying to do this. This is our plan for biodiversity and biolinks across the peninsula. And all of these areas are areas that we're focusing on getting more vegetation into so that we can actually improve the environment and improve the productivity of the peninsula and reduce the impacts of climate change. We're also expanding outside our realm. We have a partnership with the Western Port Biosphere Foundation. How many of you know that you're actually living in a United Nations declared biosphere? You don't have to answer me. Just think about it for a sec. You are, and it's one of only 3 in Australia. This really is a very special area. And the biosphere covers essentially the area that you see in green. It's actually a little bit more than that, but that's just showing the relevant shires and council groups around the area. Well, we're already talking to the land care groups over in Casey, Cardinia, and down here in Bass Coast. And we're going to be taking what we've learned here and how we put things together and providing that to them so the thing starts to expand. So over a larger area, we're now having all the benefits that I just told you about. When I say now, I probably won't be alive when all that comes to fruition, but I'll be feeling very pleased when I die that I know it's heading in that direction. So with that, I'll finish up. And I've left some additional reading here. You can see the blue bits tell you, if you click on that, you can go find the information. The information document is one I wrote a few years ago, and I'll send that I may have already sent it to you, Kathy, but I'll send it to you again, and you're welcome to send that around everyone. And the final one, if you feel like having a good tabletop book to have, Natural Asset Farming by Linda Meyer is not particularly expensive, at least by modern standards, it's not. And it's a very good book. And I'll finish there and pass it back over to Kathy.
Put my unmute on. Thank you so much, Greg. Do we have any questions for Greg? Are you happy to take some questions? Now, I also
Absolutely.
must remind everybody that this has been recorded and is being recorded. So just be aware of that. If anyone has any questions, please unmute yourself, I guess. Looks like
I've got a question.
Thanks, Mel.
Greg, thanks very much. That was a great talk. I have a bit of a left of centre question. So I live on a very small property, 6.35 acres, and I got absolutely smashed in that huge windstorm that happened quite recently. And what you were saying just made me wonder if it was something to do with the layout of my property as to why I got so badly smashed. You know, so I've got about 100 metres of clear paddock, and then all of the trees on the other side of that, with the wind coming across that paddock, got smashed, including some really good sound trees. And I'm wondering, do you think it could be something to do with all the bushland on the other side and the way that it's shaped that might have caused my paddock to get, or rather my tree line to get so smashed?
The answer is I'd have to look to give a definitive answer, but I suspect not.
Okay.
That windstorm was an easterly wind, a very strong easterly wind. We virtually never get easterly winds that are strong. Well, we haven't historically. We've actually had a couple in the last 3 or 4 years. But that particular one was, the wind wasn't overly strong by standards. We've had stronger westerlies. But imagine you're a tree now, right? So you're growing, and the wind always blows from this side. You put roots out in here to buffet yourself against it, but you don't bother putting roots out here. Why would you bother? You know, it's just, you're just wasting your growth energy. So basically, this is now nice and strong, but now along comes a really strong wind from this side, and they aren't set up to take it, and over they go. Now, with your coming across a paddock and coming up against a bush patch, was that a shelter belt type thing, or was it a large bush patch?
No, so it's come across a large bush patch, then hit about 100 metres clear, and then hit my tree line.
Oh, okay. So yeah,
and actually, I normally do get easterlies in the spot that I live. It's just the
but
way
do you get strong easterlies? That's the difference. The peninsula,
I think so, but not that strong.
Not that strong. That's the thing. The peninsula gets easterlies, but it rarely gets very strong easterlies. In that case, you've got the air coming across, and you've got a bush patch here that finishes, and then you've got a long paddock. The air could have come back down to the surface in that distance, depending on how sharp the line was at the edge of this bush paddock patch over here.
It's very sharp. Yeah, if
it's sharp, then yes, it will have come down. So it could have been a combination of two effects.
Yeah, right. That's fascinating. Thanks.
You could to some extent counter that by just simply planting some lower level shrubs and bushes along the edge of that sharp edge.
Yes, right.
And you don't even have to make it all that wide, because you've just got to get enough to get that nice drop back down from the upper level stuff.
Oh, hey, that's great. That's exactly what I was contemplating listening to you talk and thinking I'd love to stop that from happening again. Thank you. Will do.
Well, try that. And where are you living?
Narre Warren East.
Narre Warren. That's a bit far to come for an afternoon, but try and get in touch with the local land care people, and if they not all land care people are really all that up to date on these things, but if there's any problem, I get over there every now and then when I just feel like going bush, if you know what I mean. So basically, we could probably arrange a time where I could come by and have a look and give you a bit better information.
Oh, I'd be fascinated. Thank you so much. Much appreciated.
Alison, did you have a question?
Yes, I've got a question. Sorry, I was trying to work out how to put my hand up or something, but anyway, yeah. Well, first of all, again, Greg, thanks so much for the really interesting talk. I'd like to ask a question. I don't know if I'll have all the information that you might ask me. We're in a different area, so we're over near towards Yarra Glen, so I'm in Kangaroo Ground, and our property has a lot of bushland on it, and then we have about 6 acres that I do in a track system for 2 horses. And in the middle of that is a gully that is also a winter creek. And so we have planted out some sections of it, but I'm thinking maybe we've done it incorrectly. So the gully we have, if we have a wind, it's usually a northerly wind. But then sometimes we have our own weather zone because we also, where we're positioned just down from the ridge, we also have wind coming up from the Yarra River. So
You get the valley winds, yeah.
yeah, so we get the valley wind. So like if we do a small burn off occasionally, like we hold our breaths because we can have our own weather pattern in the gully.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering whether we should look at, so the gully was bare when we arrived 7 years ago, and we've planted, and they're coming on, sort of clusters of what you've been describing tonight. And so I'm wondering whether we're better off sticking with the idea of kind of the cluster groups, or if we should do a longer line, because our clusters are pretty small compared to what you're describing.
Yeah, how big are your clusters? Just sort of roughly meters across or something like that?
I reckon 10 meters by 6. Like
no, they're not. They're a lot better than nothing as far as the
Yeah.
gully is concerned, and they will do things like help stop erosion and such. But you'd be far better off putting vegetation along the gully. Is the gully got a permanent stream in it, or is it an erosion gully?
I'd say it's probably an erosion gully. It has a winter. When we bought the property, we were told there's a winter creek. But what it really is if there's a downpour, that section of the gully floods and then subsides. And some of it runs down towards the Yarra through our neighbours' properties.
Yeah. I mean, if it was my property, I would actually vegetate the whole thing. I'd put some vegetation in the gully and then along the edges, and I'd go out at least 5 meters from the edge with the vegetation as well. And you don't have to put eucalypts in if you don't want to. You could put a lot of acacias and various other species along there. Or eucalypts are going to do no harm. If you're going to put it in the center of the thing, it can be a bit problematic because, say, you put in a swamp gum and it gets very dry in summer, that's not good for the swamp gum. But let's say you put in a peppermint gum and it gets very wet in winter, that's not good for the peppermint gum. So you have a few choices to make there, but I would certainly at least be doing bush all the way along. And at the very worst, it will actually help stop the erosion. It will also help stop local flooding, but it'll be a very, very good little patch of biodiversity because it's wet in winter and things like that. That attracts a lot more little creatures than if it was dry all the time or it was wet all the time.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much. We've noticed a difference even in the 7 years, just even having done what we've done. And that just gives me heaps more ideas. Thanks so much, Greg.
Yep, no worries.
So are there any more questions from anybody? It seems like you've covered everything, Greg. So thank you so much for your talk this evening. We're very, very appreciative.
Yeah, no worries there. And as I said, I'll send you in the morning the entire talk so people can get the talk and click onto those references if they choose. and I'll send you that information document. I'm perfectly happy for you to send it out to everyone or anyone, whatever you want to do.
Okay, thanks so much. There's quite a number of people that have registered, so I'll send it out to all of the people that have registered.
Yep.
Thanks again.
All right. And thanks for organising it, Kathy.
You're
Thanks. That was fascinating.
great. And thanks for everyone for coming along. Okay. Thanks, Marianne. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.